This is BBC One in the South East. Now the news at 10 o'clock with Peter Sissons and Mike Embley.
Family doctors drop an election bombshell saying their service is near collapse. Most say they're ready to quit the health service if there aren't big reforms. Thatcher battles on with a warning that Britain could get an elective dictatorship. Fuel protesters on the move. They say it's a reminder, not a blockade. Death of a young symbol of hope in South Africa's fight with AIDS.
In the southeast, a godsend for 3 million London commuters. Next week's tube strikes are off. And has this man been sending out racist hate mail for the past 9 years? Police want to question him.
Good evening. The UK's 36,000 family doctors concentrated the minds of the politicians on health today, with a dire warning that the service they provide is on the brink of collapse. They've voted by a big majority to consider a mass resignation from the health service unless their grievances are addressed. Their leaders, who want to negotiate a new contract, turned the screw with just 6 days to the election. They want less bureaucracy and pay linked to quality of service rather than patient numbers. First, our political editor, Andrew Marr.
These are the things where people are expecting, the hip replacement.
This is politics as Labour likes it. On the Liverpool set of the soap opera Brookside, Jacket Off, leader and people thrashing it out together.
There is good and bad going on, because there is good stuff, and actually at its best.
But outside election land, it was less Brookside than casualty today, as family doctors threatened Mr Blair with a mass resignation from the NHS.
The result demonstrates the depth of disenchantment, despair and disillusionment felt by GPs throughout the United Kingdom. Regrettably, they dramatically confirm what we've been telling governments for years, that general practice is at the end of its tether.
Mr Blair, who will be spending long hours in this battle bus in the last stretch of the campaign, has always said he wants the election to be about the future of public services. Well, he's getting his wish, though perhaps not quite as he'd planned. In a BBC News online interview with me, he found it far easier to attack the Conservatives than angry public service staff.
We are the first to recognise we've got more to do. The answer surely is to keep the investment coming in and not go for the Conservatives and their plans on cuts.
And what would you say to these doctors then today?
Well, I would say, of course, we are in the course of a negotiation with the doctors. We are actually increasing the numbers of GPs. We're putting a record investment into the health service, and surely the vital thing is to keep that investment going in rather than turn the clock back to the Conservative days of cuts.
Yet some Tories have been desperate for Mr Hague to speak less about the pound and more about schools and hospitals. And today's doctors' vote gave him the political equivalent of a free kick.
What we're seeing today with the doctors is so similar to what we see with the teachers, with the police officers. The morale across our public services has never been so low. And the people of this country, in 6 days' time, have their opportunity to pass their own verdict, their own judgment.
Charles Kennedy, here being shown a police bicycle, then steered the argument down an unexpected track.
You can't solve the underfunding problems overnight, even on the basis of our proposals. Our proposals go further than any of the other parties, but they don't in themselves go far enough. And I think you've got
well, that's frank, but it's not just in England where doctors are up in arms.
We've got to ensure we've got the maximum investment in our public services, in health and education within Scotland. We're too dependent on private finance already in these sectors. And if Tony Blair goes further down this route, he'll drag the Labour Party in Scotland with him.
What about that then, eh?
Today's doctors' protest hasn't punctured the mood of optimism in the Blair team. More of a pitch invasion than a lost goal, but it's a stiff reminder to the captain of what's ahead if he wins. Tony Blair feels completely convinced that he can win the arguments on public services with other politicians. But winning those same arguments with angry doctors, well, that's a lot harder. Andrew Marr, BBC News, Westminster.
The GP's ballot has made it clear how much resentment and frustration they're feeling. More than 80% of those who voted in the ballot said they would consider resigning. They say their workload has increased enormously and they want more doctors and less paperwork. Our social affairs editor Niall Dickson reports.
This box is my incoming mail, and this is just from today.
A mountain of paperwork and not enough time for patients. Just one of many complaints from Britain's family doctors.
And this pile is all NHS directives about how to run the service. There's nothing here about patients at all individually.
Now, along with more than half the GPs in Britain, Dr Brownhold has said she'll resign from the NHS unless the government agrees a new contract which reduces her workload.
As wide as you can, say,
It's the same story in one surgery after another. Patients expect more, the government demands more. The doctors say it can't be done without more resources and more staff.
The workload has more or less doubled, and that's come about as a result of the increasing demands that patients bring and the increasing expectations of what now can be done.
Family doctors will not abandon their NHS patients. In a sense, the threat to resign is a negotiating tactic. But the frustration is real, both among GPs and those they treat.
Before you could just come in, couldn't you, and just see a doctor. These days you have to wait, you know. I've been waiting over a week to see the doctor, but it's not their fault, you know.
Outside Labour headquarters this afternoon, the Health Secretary produced a few doctors sympathetic to what the government achieved so far. But the middle of an election campaign is not the time to pick a fight with the medical profession, and he accepts that GPs are having a tough time.
There are very real problems and there is real pressure at the front line in public services. But the only answer to the pressure is to get investment in, to get reforms in, and that is what we are committed to.
But there's resentment among senior hospital doctors as well. Some of them are also talking about quitting the NHS. All these medical moans allow the opposition parties to claim Labour is all talk, no delivery.
You couldn't get a clearer indication that people on the front line in the health service are under real pressure. That means we need more resources in the service, less bureaucracy, which is actually stopping doctors getting on with the work of treating patients.
Doctors want to get their clinical freedom back. They do not want to be interfered with by politicians, and they want to run for the benefit of their patients, not the targets of the government.
For all the grand promises, helping GPs like Gillian Brownhold cope with ever-rising demand will not be easy. Producing extra staff takes time. Just keeping the ones they've got will be an uphill struggle. Britain's doctors feel angry and disillusioned, and whatever Labour say, many do feel let down by this government, as indeed many felt let down by the last Conservative administration. Whoever wins this election will inherit a profession in crisis. Employing more doctors will help. On its own, it's unlikely to be enough. Niall Dickson, BBC News, at the British Medical Association.
The BMA's claim that the country needs 10,000 more GPs is based on international comparisons. Other countries simply have more doctors than we do. Peter Morgan has been looking at the figures.
Schools and hospitals first, says the Prime Minister, but what about GPs? Far more of us come into contact with the health service in the local surgery than on the hospital ward. And yet many doctors on this front line of the health service feel ill-treated and ignored. You get some idea of a British GP's workload if you look at the level of health provision abroad. In the UK, there are 6 GPs for every 10,000 people. In America, it's 8. In Germany, there are 10. And in France, 15, 2.5 times the number of GPs that we have here. And the number of doctors isn't growing remotely fast enough to keep up with demand. In 1995 in England, the number of GPs grew by just 134, an increase in a total of less than 0.5%. That number has grown to nearly 300 extra GPs in the past 2 years, but that's still nowhere near the 500 a year which Labour says are needed. So what's to be done?
I think what politicians have to do is actually talk up the public services in general and general practice in particular. And I think in some ways they've really failed to do that. They've talked down the public sector, they've talked down public services. As a result, young people don't want to do it.
All the major parties are trusting that a big injection of cash can turn that problem of GP recruitment round. The Labour Party says it wants to create at least 2,000 new GPs in the next 4 years in England. The Lib Dems want 4,600 new doctors across the UK, but that includes hospital staff. The Conservatives aren't giving numbers, but say they'll match Labour's spending on health. But what do targets matter if you just can't fill the jobs? The BMA reckons around half of all new doctors need to become GPs to keep the primary care service fully staffed. Yet, in a recent study, just 1 in 5 medical students said they wanted to go into general practice after they had qualified.
Lady Thatcher today warned that another Labour landslide in the election would give Britain an elective dictatorship. Tony Blair hit back, accusing the Conservatives of trying to deter people from voting Labour so they could sneak in by the back door. Lady Thatcher was campaigning in Romsey in Hampshire. Our special correspondent Ben Brown was there.
Lady Thatcher's still got more pulling power than most of the current cabinet and shadow cabinet.
Mrs. Thatcher, thank you for all you did for this country.
Today she came to Romsey in Hampshire with a warning. She told us that another big landslide for Labour could create a kind of Tony Blair dictatorship.
The warning was encapsulated in the old phrase, if you've got a very big majority, you really have got an elective dictatorship. And that's bad.
Did that apply when you had a big majority?
No, we never had a big majority the size of the one they've got.
In the closing stages of this campaign, Lady Thatcher is working hard to deliver the Conservative Party vote, with the hope of reducing Tony Blair's majority, and with it the risk of an elective dictatorship, as she sees it. 18 years ago, one of her ministers issued a similar warning about a Tory landslide.
I think landslides, on the whole, don't produce successful governments.
The then Mrs. Thatcher slapped him down and sacked him. In those days, she rather liked landslides.
I think that I could handle a landslide majority all right.
We'll have some bacon to go with sausages.
Today, Lady Thatcher, the grocer's daughter, went shopping in a butcher's. Here, she seemed to anticipate Tory defeat, admitting it will be hard to overturn Tony Blair's majority.
I know full well that it's very difficult to get down from 177 on one side to about 70 on the other in one go.
But at other times today, the old Thatcher fighting spirit came back.
I should be absolutely thrilled if we got a majority.
Really?
Absolutely thrilled.
One personal
question. Tell me, you sound as if you're very anxious to give a report that they're going to win. My message is that we can win. Have you got it?
Among Lady Thatcher's admirers today, a 94-year-old pensioner.
Yes,
I just wish
they're
you were
exciting
back
years.
again.
Well, I don't think I will get back again.
And instead of running the country, Lady Thatcher was buying herself some more food for the weekend. Paid for, she said, with a British pound she wants to save. Her fellow shoppers had mixed views.
Did have a lot of time for her when she was in Paris, so I ain't got much time for her now.
She's a magnificent woman, and she did a lot for us when she was in power, and I wish she was going in now.
Whatever you think of her, more than a decade after she left Downing Street, Lady Thatcher is still playing a starring role in this election. Ben Brown, BBC News, Hampshire.
The spectre of fuel protests has returned to trouble the government tonight. More than 100 lorries are reported to be heading for several oil refineries around the country. Police are already guarding a number of sites, and as yet there's no word of lorries successfully blocking the distribution of petrol and diesel. David Shukman reports.
If there's one sight the Labour leadership must be dreading, it's this one. The first of an estimated 70 trucks headed from a rendezvous in Carmarthenshire this evening for the oil depots of the South Wales coast. The fuel protests last year proved to be the single greatest threat to Labour's standing in the polls. Tonight the truckers said they weren't acting politically, but wanted nothing more than a cut in fuel tax, and said they wouldn't try to physically block the refineries.
We're just going to ask the drivers if they deliver, if you will, to petrol stations, not to go out. If they decide that they are going to go out, they'll be left to go out.
Outside the refinery at Avonmouth near Bristol, another protest was underway, far smaller, but one of several across the country, providing clear evidence of national coordination. But here too, they stressed, they weren't targeting Labour.
We were protesting 4 years ago with a Tory government. It's not political, it's a survival of a transport industry.
And at the Stanlow refinery in Cheshire tonight, a crucial supply point, some 60 protesters turned out, peacefully they said, while these empty tankers were arriving. The protesters are asking tanker drivers not to leave the depot, but won't stop them if they try. But once again, the threat to fuel supplies is clear, and the timing could not be more sensitive. David Shukman, BBC News.
Well, our political editor Andrew Marr is at Westminster. Andrew, the doctors lob their grenade into the campaign. The fuel protesters are flexing their muscles. Are these events for which ministers are prepared?
Well, they certainly knew about the possibility of the doctors' protest coming. I think the fuel protesters is a bit more of a surprise. They're connected to this extent that some people in the government have accused the doctors privately of trying to hijack the general election campaign, and that's clearly also the view of some people about the fuel protests. And what the Prime Minister's office is saying is, listen, it's not many days now until you can vote. If you really object to petrol taxes that much, express your protest in the proper way through the ballot box. For goodness sake, don't go off and start to blockade refineries, and certainly don't start to do what some people are doing tonight already, I'm afraid, which is panic buy.
Well, you've been out this week, Andrew, with both the Prime Minister and Mr Hague. What are your principal impressions now that the campaign is approaching its final days?
Well, here's a thought. I'm not at all sure that we are witnessing a general election in the old sense. I think we are seeing several different kinds of election which all happen to end on about the same day, at the same time. The regional elections are all very different at the moment. The Southwest, with the Euro dominating, feels very, very different to the campaign in the Midlands. The campaign in London is very different to the campaign in Kent, where asylum is dominating. And of course, Scotland is having its own campaign as well. So the old sense of a sort of single political community having a single campaign seems to have gone. And that may explain what I pick up from all over, which is perplexity and unease in all the party headquarters. They don't really know what people think, and they don't quite know what the outcome's going to be, however clear the polls have seemed to be up to now.
Andrew Marr, thank you. A standoff is continuing in the United States between an army and a new opinion poll tonight gives Labour its narrowest lead of the election campaign. The ICM poll for Channel 4 News puts Labour on 43%, 12 points ahead of the Conservatives, whose support at 31% is largely unchanged. The Liberal Democrats are on 19%, their highest rating of the campaign. With other opinion polls suggesting a low turnout next week, all the parties are urging people to get out and vote. The number of people voting has fallen significantly in all types of elections over the last 10 years, and in 1997 the MP for Leeds Central was elected by the lowest turnout since the war. George Alagiah has been to Leeds to see why voters are shunning the ballot box.
Welcome to the good life. This is the new, modern, regenerated Britain. But last time they voted for an MP here, 4 out of 5 stayed away. Some call it the politics of contentment. Or is it? The underside of the feel-good factor is the feel-left-out factor, which sums up the mood in the nearby estates. Here, where people live on the edge, there's a perception that national politics is no good at the little things that matter so much. They say this playground was refurbished only after pressure at a local level. Dawn and her neighbours were active in that campaign, but will not be voting.
It's all about, you know, money and this EU and things like that. It's nothing that actually relates to me personally. It's not about normal working people. It's not about people who live on council estates.
Looking around a place like this, you can understand why, when the politicians say vote for me, some people are saying why vote at all. So there's another group who believes that putting a cross on a ballot paper every 4 or 5 years is now the least effective way of bringing about change on the issues they care about. For those who've spent 20 years trying to stop the excavation of peat from Hatfield Moor outside Leeds, no party offers the kind of policies they're looking for.
It's like the choice between Pepsi and Coke. And saying, well, why do you ever want to drink anything else? Because you've got a choice between Pepsi and Coke. They're nearly the same. And what do you do if you want to think outside that box?
We've got hundreds of messages here from local people, and we'd like to hand those to you.
This confrontation symbolises a more general switch, especially among the young, to direct action.
Remain where you are, please. This is private property.
Beyond the law, beyond party politics.
Don't always pick on the flower pot men, it's discrimination. Is that right?
For a few minutes, the machines will be forced to shut down. No campaign manifesto has achieved that.
We're all here taking action, trying to get our own views across and trying also to affect the issues directly. Apathy is going out and voting and pretending that everything's taken care of.
The minstrel protesters and the no voters on the estates both have something in common, a disenchantment not just with politicians but with the system in which they have to operate. George Alagiah, BBC News, Leeds.
It's 28 minutes to 11. We're getting more on that explosion in Israel.